Good morning. It is a great pleasure for me to address you from my home office in Oslo, 500 kilometers away from the Bergen site, and particularly on a topic which is of great interest to me and to many others, namely the Limits to Growth study that appeared in 1972, where my friends and I wrote a report about the global future, which led to extensive discussion. This discussion actually was presented very nicely last Monday by David Lane in a presentation that you should actually check out, where he went through the 50 years of heated debate that has followed the publication of limits. This discussion continues to the day, in spite, or perhaps because, there are still many vocal critics of the study and its meta conclusions that were as follows. Point 1, we live on a finite planet. 2, if growth in the physical human footprint continues for long, we will run into conflict with these physical limits. And thirdly, unless there is change, this will actually happen within a fairly short period, 100 years. And in the worst case, the conflict will take the form of collapse, at least collapse in well-being, but also possibly in population and consumption. And the important point is, of course, that what needs to stop growing in order to achieve sustainability according to limits is the physical footprint measured in tons per year. It is, of course, immaterial whether the value added, the GDP measured in dollars per year, continues growing as long as there is decoupling. But these conclusions are still hotly debated, and what I will do today is to try to answer the fairly simple question. At least one should think it is simple after 50 years. Was the limits to growth right? And let me get my slides going. So, Limits to Growth appeared 50 years ago, and it presented, in reality, 12 scenarios for the world development from 1970 to the year 2100. 6 of these scenarios, like the one I show, were pessimistic societies, scenarios where something went wrong in society during the 21st century. Either there were too much people, too few resources, too much pollution. 6 of the scenarios, on the other hand, were optimistic scenarios where humanity managed to change its ways in manners that led to more or less sustainability, more or less stable conditions. The important point in 1992 was that it was impossible for us, or for science, to tell which of these 12 scenarios was the most likely one. So all we could do with the limited knowledge at the time was to argue that society should try to keep away from the sad scenarios and then try to focus on the optimistic scenarios on sustainability. And you should think that 50 years after the publication of the book, and 4 million copies later, I use, along with my friend Dennis Meadows, the number 4 million as the best estimate of the number of books actually sold. We think the numbers quoted in the literature are much, much too high. The fact that 4 million books were sold, however, does not mean that 4 million books were read. Most people have a wrong impression of what the book actually said. So, what's the limits to growth? Right. The problem is, of course, that the limits to growth was not a forecast. It was simply 12 scenarios, 12 runs from the World 3 system dynamics model. And none of these runs were presented as the most likely future. We did name one of the runs, the standard run, the one I'm showing you, and not because it was business as usual, but because it was a useful starting point for the pedagogic task of presenting the likely consequences of various policy actions over the ensuing 50 to 100 years. So since there is no forecast in limits to growth, it is of course impossible to compare that forecast with actual developments over the last 50 years and draw a simple conclusion on whether or not limits was right. So the only thing one can do, and which is what I will be doing in this talk, is to compare actual developments with the full envelope of the 12 scenarios, the area covered by those 12 scenarios. And then the only conclusion one can draw is whether the 12 scenarios were wisely chosen in 1972. Because if real development has been far away from the scenario, the envelope of scenarios, then of course the book would have been much less relevant than if history actually did evolve according to the envelope of scenarios. So for each of the scenarios, what I will do is to present, like I've done here for the case of population, you know, the 12 scenarios that were described in the Limits to Growth book in 1972. And here I hasten to add my warm thanks to my old friend Ulrik Goluke, who has been struggling, you know, to take the original code from the technical report published in 1974 and translate it into Vensim and then generate these historically quite interesting graphs. The standard run, you know, our starting point for the discussion is the one curve that is slightly thicker than the others. We then proceed to add the historical development for population, in this case, taken from typically historically UN data. And you see the world population did grow from roughly 3.5 billion in 1970 to 7 billion in 2010. And importantly, this actual development is essentially in the center of the 12 scenarios in limits. It is actually possible to do a few other comments. First of all, you can see that humanity did not choose to follow the lower curves. Here, the scenarios that involved stabilization of the world population in the early 70s or 80s. And you can also argue that it looks as if the world population has actually grown less fast, slower than the standard run. But it is a sad fact that the history is not long enough to make statements on the interesting aspects of the population scenarios, namely the collapses out to the right beyond 2030. So in order to add another element into this discussion, I've added a forecast, the best forecast I know about, from 2010 to 2050, in order to see how the limit scenarios chosen 40 years ago compare with best estimates produced in at this point in time. And in my typically immodest style, I've chosen the best forecast I know, which is the one I wrote myself with, again, the help of Ulrik in 2012, and it was published in the book called 2052, A Global Forecast for the Next 40 Years. The advantage of that forecast is that it is 10 years old, roughly, and that I know that it has been correct, essentially, over the last 10 years. So if we add the 2052 forecast to the graph, we get the dotted line, which once more leads to the conclusion that the 12 limits scenarios were chosen in a suitable manner. They still cover what is likely to happen, and the two and covers the extremes on the upper and on the lower side. And in addition to this, one can say a little bit more, assuming that the 2052 forecast proves correct during the next 30 years. One can say that there will not be a collapse in the global population before 2050, and also that the population peak, which is an interesting aspect of the 2052 forecast, will be much lower, roughly at 9 billion people, compared to the 12 or so in the limits to growth standard run. I then repeat this procedure for the other 4 important variables in limits. So the first one, the second one is the industrial output per capita. This is a measure of physical consumption per person, and I mimic this with the GDP per person from 1970 from the Penn World Tables, measured in PPP dollars to try to get a number which has something to do with industrial output per capita. And once more, you see, as with population, that the development has been in the middle of the envelope of the limits to growth scenarios. Extending this using the 2052 forecast shows that the limit scenarios now are largely below the likely future, but still there are alternatives above. It is also clear that if there are no collapses before 2050, one would argue that limits was essentially wrong in highlighting the possibility of collapse in industrial output per capita. Let's move to the third important variable, food per capita. Again, you see the large number of scenarios, the 12 scenarios, and in this case, the standard run, the stronger line, is actually at the lower end of the envelope of scenarios. And here, very interestingly, is the historical data for the food per person. And you see for the first time that limits was wrong. limits, all, or the choice of scenarios in limits was wrong. All the scenarios assumed that the world would produce more food than the world has actually done during the last 40 years. This is interesting, and particularly since, you know, most critics of limits criticize it for being pessimistic in its assumptions and, you know, assuming Malthusian views where there would be too little food compared to the needs. The world has actually chosen an even more Malthusian strategy than we had envisaged. So production of food has only grown on a per capita basis by 30% or so over the last 40 years. And if we then extend this forecast with the 2052 forecast, we see that that brings us back into the main envelope of limits scenarios. But the general idea of the actual development, namely steady increase in the food availability per person with a solid line, does not match well with the picture of limits, where food first expands dramatically and then declines dramatically. The fourth variable is resource use, or it's actually resources remaining in the ground, and we use as a proxy the amount of fossil fuels remaining in the ground, which has declined, as one would expect, over the last 40 years and will continue to decline over the next 40 years as we are continuing, you know, at least some reliance on coal, oil and gas during this period, according to the 2052 forecast, which basically assumes that mankind will react to the climate challenge, but so slow that the temperature will exceed the Paris goals at the end of this century. So you see, resources are declining, but they're not running out, as in the most pessimistic scenarios in limits, nor are they keeping up as well as in the more optimistic scenarios. And then finally, we do the similar comparison in the case of the pollution level variable from limits, where there are many various and wildly differing scenarios. The standard run is one where pollution increases steadily until the 30s and then declines again after a collapse in the second half of the century. The actual development, and here I use global warming, the temperature rise from pre-industrial times as an indicator, is that we have had rapid increase in the pollution level. You know, I'm measuring then the pollution, what is called persistent pollution in the limits book is here mimicked with the temperature rise according to the NOAA time series. And if we then use our Eskimo model to simulate further developments, we get a global warming that peaks at 2.5 degrees centigrade in 2075, and in many ways is a funny mixture of the various limits scenarios. You see, the interesting thing is that the scenarios are still well chosen in the sense that they are both above and below the likely development. So in summary, this means that if you compare the 12 limits scenarios with actual developments over the last 40 years, 50 years, you see that except in the case of food, things are rather relevant in this, which means that the World 3 model was used to generate scenarios that actually are relevant even 50 years after they were made, in the sense that they have some connection to real world development. And this seems to remain the case over the next 30 years in case the 2052 forecast is correct. So one can basically conclude that we have seen world developments more or less fall within the envelope of limits to growth scenarios, and we have seen that there is not yet a collapse in the sense of dramatic decline in population or in consumption. And then, interestingly, it's possible to say one more thing after this comparison, and that is that it is possible, I believe, to decide, or at least to start betting on which of the 12 scenarios that are most likely to be the most precise one. And I think this is what it was scenario number 2 in the Limits to Growth book, namely the pollution crisis. You know, a run where mankind obtains enough resources to continue physical growth for such a long period that the emissions from that growth finally overwhelms the pollution absorption system. In this scenario number 2 shown in this screen, you know, the collapse in population occurs in 2040, but the consumption collapse roughly in the 2030, around 2030. It may well be that the real development as the climate crisis evolves will be somewhat more gradual than what is indicated in this thing. But I do think that the pollution scenario is the one that best mimic what actually did happen to the world from 1970 to from 1970 to the year 2100. So thank you very much. I hope I can live another 20 years to see a little bit more about what is happening, but I'm afraid I will die long before it is clear whether the collapse forecast actually proves true. Thank you very much. And then, if there are questions, I would be more than happy to answer them. Thank you very much.